Let's have a look at Abraham and Sarah. Welcome to a dysfunctional family. Abraham and Sarah, the idyllic couple. Not. Here's the story. Here we have Abraham, who has two brothers named Nahor and Haran. Haran has a son named Lot and two daughters named Milcah and Iscah. It's a bit complicated as family trees go. Notice Terach here, or Terah, who is Abraham's father, and we have Sarai, whose name is changed to Sarah later in the story. She's the half-sister, supposedly, of Abram. We'll talk more about that. And again, note Nahor, Haran, and this interesting character, Lot, whom we'll get to. Now it says in Genesis 20, verse 12, quoting Abraham, talking about Sarai or Sarah, "She really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife." So we got to get the basic family tree a little bit established here. Genesis 11:29, Abram, which is his name before he becomes Abraham, and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, father of both Milcah and Iscah. Complicated lineage. Okay. Sarai, here's where we get into the heart of it, was barren. She had no children. Notice the parallelism. The Bible doesn't mince words, and when it repeats something like barrenness, it's really, really important. This is also the essence of biblical poetry. It doesn't have to rhyme in Hebrew, but it will simply be one statement parallel to another in a kind of repetition, a parallelism. Sarai was barren, she had no children, emphasizing it and also giving it a poetic quality. Terach took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, his daughter-in-law Sarai, wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans. That's the home city of the family, very important, to go to Canaan or Canaan. But they came to Haran and they settled there. So the family starts out in Ur, very important city, and they make it to Haran, sort of a midway point. The Bible just recounts the name of Sarai, the fact that she was barren. Doesn't tell us how Abraham acquired her. Maybe he bought her. Maybe some kind of marriage of convenience. And we ask, where's the love here? Where's the romance? Is there any? You might say the silence speaks louder than anything. Is there romantic love in the Bible? Instead, what we might end up with is something more akin to the despised wife syndrome. We'll get into all that. The Bible just skirts the issue and talks about the call of Abraham, the famous language in the Hebrew text, Lech Lecha, where God says to Abram, go you, go ye, get out from your house and from your father's house and go to the land which I will show you, from the 12th chapter of Genesis. Very, very famous passage, the call of Abraham. That's where all the emphasis is. And marital matters, family is pretty much in the background. And there's the verse, Genesis 12:1. Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred and thy father's house, to the land which I will show thee. Then we move on to the 10th verse of Genesis 12. Now there was a famine in the land. And Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but let you live. Is Abram just scared for his own skin? Do we really expect they're going to kill him? Or is this just an excuse for something? Maybe he just wants to get rid of her. Have to try to read between the lines and wonder what's going on. You have to wonder where the love is, where the marriage is. If there had ever been a marriage, you can make an argument that it's long over by now. Doesn't matter that she was gorgeous. He wants progeny. He wants descendants. And you might dump on Abram and call him utterly selfish. That seems to be what he cares about. She's barren, and so he's quite willing to pawn her off, as it were. Genesis 12:13, just say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Does that bother anybody? So his life will be spared, so I will be treated well for your sake. Is this the real reason? We just see him as kind of a pimp. He turns his wife into a prostitute. Of course, she's barren. He doesn't have to worry about birth control. Many childless couples exist, of course, in every day and age down to our own. They don't get divorced, and the wife certainly doesn't get pimped out. Genesis 12:14, when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that she was a very beautiful woman. When Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, men servants and maidservants, and camels. The wife does the work, and isn't that the way it turns out? The pimp gets the pay in the end. Is this some kind of horrific spousal abuse? Genesis 12:17. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me? He said. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister? So I took her to be my wife. Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. You'd think Abraham would have learned a lesson, wouldn't you? But no, apparently not. We move on in the narrative, and here's in chapter 13, so Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and his nephew, whom we met, Lot, went with him. And Abraham became very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. He just forgets all about it. He apparently enjoys the proceeds of his previous vice. Genesis 16, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. It's harping on this again. But she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. Maybe you think she could be just testing him? Does he agree a bit too easily? And by the way, who has narrative power in all of this? That's a literary critical term. In other words, who is driving the action? Who's the active one? Who's the active character? It seems to be Sarai, doesn't it? Not Abraham. The woman, not the man. The ancient Jewish historian Josephus says, by God's command, Sarah brought one of her Egyptian handmaidens named Hagar. Look how Josephus, the Jewish historian, is trying to say, well, it was all God's idea after all. Isn't it her idea? The Bible makes it clear it was Sarah's idea. Of course, polygamy was quite normal in those days. Usually, though, it was the man's idea. Men in that particular day and age and time and that culture were seen as naturally polygamous. Women, monogamous. So having multiple wives in biblical culture was quite kosher. But a second man for a woman, ooh, that was adultery. Double standard here. In other words, according to biblical law, a man can have as many women as he wants, as many wives as he wants, but a woman can have only one man. Something to think about. Genesis chapter 16, verse 3. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. Second wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she, that is Hagar, knew she was pregnant, she, that is Hagar, began to despise her mistress. You can almost hear Hagar, I'm pregnant and you're not. And Sarai blames Abraham. Then Sarai said to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Verse 6, your servant is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Isn't that interesting? Abraham takes no responsibility at all. He admits to nothing. He throws it all off on her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur, and once more the deity, that is God, intervenes. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. In other words, be a thorn in her flesh. Go ahead, bug her. The angel added, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. Interesting, because it echoes that divine call from Genesis 12 to Abraham, where God says, go ye to the land which I will show you, and I will make your descendants great as the sands on the seashore. Too numerous to count. It's the same promise now being given here. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now with child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. Ishmael means God hears. These names in Hebrew have great significance and become plays on words. Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He'll be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. He will live in hostility toward all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me, for she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. And that is why the well was called Be'er Lahai Ro'i. All these names, again, have great significance. The well of the living one who sees me. Be'er means well. A well, Lahai, the living one, Ro'i, who sees me. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. And by the way, in biblical stories, important things seem to happen at wells. It's a recurring theme. We could call it a literary motif. Something, an element that appears, that recurs over and over in stories. So let's please pay attention to wells. Important things happen at wells, as we shall see as things proceed. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. God also said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, Sarai means Yah, that is the divine name, is prince. Sar in Hebrew means prince. As for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai, but her name will be Sarah, princess. Sar is prince, Sarah, princess. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Finally, God rewards Sarah. She's been through a lot, after all. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. Wow. His attitude towards Sarah is almost mocking. Never mind that the deity has just blessed her. He doesn't seem to care for her at all. He seems to care more for Hagar and her child. If only Ishmael might live under your blessing. What kind of a guy is this? What kind of a marriage is left for Abraham and Sarah? Then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I'm worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure? Such cynicism. Doesn't seem to believe Abraham. There's no communication between them. I thought that's important in a marital relationship. Then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, I did not laugh. But he said, yes, you did laugh. With a little help from Legoland, we see some interesting dramatizations here, which we'll see more of as we look at our text. Jonathan Kirsch, The Harlot by the Side of the Road, page 49, where he writes, so remarkable is the news that Sarah laughs out loud. She laughs almost literally in God's face, and her son is given the name Isaac. A bit of Hebrew wordplay that means I laughed. And now the Bible shows us a deeply enigmatic scene in which we find a 15-year-old Ishmael at play with his 5-year-old stepbrother at a feast in celebration of the fact that Isaac has been weaned. But Sarah happens to see Ishmael doing something to Isaac. Something so disturbing that Sarah demands that Ishmael and his mother be cast out in the wilderness a second and final time. Exactly what does Sarah see? Exactly what does Ishmael do? In conventional English translation, Sarah sees Ishmael mocking young Isaac. Unless she saw something worse than mere mockery. A clue is to be found in the Hebrew word used in the Bible, tzachak. Tzachak is the Hebrew word. But another meaning of tzachak is fondle, and the original Hebrew text of the Bible may suggest that Sarah actually saw some kind of sex play between Ishmael and his little brother. Interestingly, as Kirsch writes, the early Greek version of the Bible, called the Septuagint. If you're not familiar with the Septuagint, look it up. Very important ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And the Latin version, called the Vulgate, which may have been translated from Hebrew manuscripts even more ancient than the traditional or the Masoretic text that has come down to us. Another important term, the traditional Hebrew text of the Bible as we have it today is called the Masoretic text. Masoret is tradition. Masorti, Masoretic text. That's the standard text that we work from today. But we're sure that there must have been earlier texts that were not preserved. The Masoretic text dates from the early Middle Ages. 500s or so of the Common Era is as far back as we can trace the Masoretic text. There had to have been earlier translations, and it could be that both the Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate drew occasionally, maybe more than occasionally, from these earlier texts that predate the Masoretic. And both the Septuagint and the Vulgate give the same verse as, quote, Sarah noticed that Ishmael was playing with her son Isaac. Is something very sordid going on here that she notices? Then we move to the story of Lot's daughters, the famous story of Lot's daughters. Again, with some help from Legoland. And we look at Jonathan Kirsch once again. Page 39. We are asked to believe that children were regarded as something less precious in biblical times than they are today, more nearly chattel than loved ones. And so a father was at liberty to do with his children, especially his daughters, exactly as he pleased. Some anthropologists suggest that the duty of a good host extended even to providing sexual companionship to his guests, supposedly observed among certain Bedouin tribes, the modern-day heirs of Abraham. It is true, too, that biblical law bestowed upon an Israelite father a considerable degree of authority over his family, and especially his children. Some critics and commentators conclude that Lot simply does not value his daughters highly enough. So when we are asked to exonerate and even to praise Lot for offering his daughters to the mob, this unruly mob that has come to his house, what does he do? He casts his daughters out to them. What grips the modern reader, by contrast, is Lot's readiness to allow the claims of courtesy to transcend moral obligations of fatherhood. It is simply not enough to shrug and say that we cannot understand how men and women who lived a few thousand years ago must have felt about their children. Both the Bible itself and the weight of biblical scholarship confirm that children were regarded by the Israelites as nothing less than a precious gift from God. The attitude of the biblical author toward Lot is not spoken out loud, but it is hard to miss in an open-eyed reading of the Bible. Lot is depicted as neither a coward nor a champion. Rather, he is shown to be a clown, a tragic buffoon, in the words of one contemporary Bible scholar, a laughingstock, a jester, a passive fool. The encounters between Lot and his neighbors, the ones demanding from Lot, and he casts his daughters to them. Those encounters remind us of the blue humor of the vaudeville stage. Lot's banter with the destroying angels over the fate of the little town called Zoar is the stuff of an Abbott and Costello routine, not a morality play. The story of Lot and his desperate daughters ought to be told in a Yiddish accent, observes one dramatist, ending with, so after all that work, what happened? Their kids were goyim. When it comes to the forbidden sexual union of father and daughters, the biblical storyteller is straight-faced and even solemn. Neither Lot nor his daughters are criticized. Lot is regarded as wholly innocent of what happens after his daughters ply him with wine and send him into a drunken stupor. Even his daughters, as we shall see, are regarded as heroines rather than seductresses. Incest, the biblical author seems to suggest, is hardly the worst offense against the moral order, especially when survival of the species, the kingship of Israel, and the birth of the Messiah appear to be at stake. And here we see the story as it continues. Run for your life. Don't look behind you. Don't stay anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains or you'll be destroyed. But what happens? Famous story. Lot's wife looks back even as God is about to destroy the cities. So much for Lot's daughters. But back to this story about Lot's daughters now making their father drunk, which Kirsch was just hinting at here, and we take him up again, even with some help from Legoland. Page 58 of Kirsch's text really gets into some interesting material. Significantly, the elaborate seduction of their father is described without a single disapproving word from the biblical author. Lot's daughters are spared the harsh judgment that is visited upon so many other women in the Bible. Starting with Eve and that damned apple, women have been depicted and mostly condemned as the willful and wily seducers of men. Potiphar's wife, Delilah, are only some of the most famous examples. A minority tradition in the rabbinical literature reaches a similar conclusion about Lot's daughters. Lot is a warning example to men to avoid being alone with women, lest they should entice them to sin, as did Lot's daughters. But the vast weight of rabbinical commentary overlooks the manner in which Lot's daughters impregnate themselves and focuses instead on their noble motive. Lot's daughters know that Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities have been destroyed. They are alone in the empty wilderness of the Judean desert, and they have no prospect of finding a suitable husband. But life must be preserved. Bottom line, the incestuous seduction of the drunken Lot serves the biblical manifest destiny of humankind. First, the simple act of bearing and rearing children is a fulfillment of the fundamental commandment to be fruitful and multiply. Second, the birth of the two boys is a crucial link in the unbroken chain of life that leads directly from creation to the Messiah. The sons of Lot's daughters are the eponymous patriarchs of two nations, Ammon and Moab, that will become bitter enemies of the Israelites. Some scholars suggest that the story of Lot and his daughters is intended by the biblical authors as a kind of black propaganda, a scurrilous tale meant to dishonor the hated Ammonites and Moabites, a product of popular political wit. But the Bible reserves a crucial role for these cave-born bastards. A Moabite woman named Ruth is destined to marry an Israelite man. We'll talk about that later in our course. And their bloodline will lead directly to the birth of David, the greatest of Israel's kings. So, the mountain cave in which Lot and his daughters seek refuge turns out to be the womb of history, and their drunken couplings amount to a sanctified union that will bestow upon the world what the Bible regards as its ultimate savior. What appears at first to be merely black comedy or black propaganda is suddenly elevated into a sublime morality tale, a saga of the struggle of life against death, in which Lot's unnamed daughters are the unlikely heroes. How about that for a feminist reading of the text? The daughters are actually the heroes. And here's the Legoland story as it continues. They ply him with drink. The end. After the whole Sodom and Gomorrah episode, Abraham plays the pimp again. Maybe the story is the result of a couple of different sources in the biblical text. The so-called documentary hypothesis talks about the Yahwist and the Elohist sources, and maybe these stories get repeated in one way or another by the two different sources. That's quite a bit of biblical criticism to dig into. But many ways to look at it. Now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar. And there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Abraham and took her. What has Kirsch to say about this? Not once, but 3 times, the Bible depicts a scene in which a patriarch passes his wife off as his sister in order to protect himself. For example, when Abraham and Sarah journeyed to Egypt to escape a famine in Canaan, Abraham insists on masquerading as Sarah's brother. In fact, Sarah is recruited for service in the harem of a pharaoh. Abraham accepts the bounty of Pharaoh without comment, and only the intervention of God himself spares Sarah from actually sleeping with Pharaoh. Abraham retorts to the same deception with yet another lusty monarch, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, with the same results. Sarah ends up in Abimelech's bed, but God warns him off at the very last minute. The same ploy is adopted by Isaac, the son of Abraham and Sarah, when he makes his own journey to Abimelech's kingdom in the company of his wife Rebekah. Like his father, Isaac retorts to the deception of calling Rebekah his sister out of plain cowardice. Abraham and Isaac adopted the Hurrian tradition. It's another ancient Near East tribe, the Hurrians. They had their own traditions of identifying their wives as their sisters. So maybe Abraham is just copying their tradition. That's what one authoritative Bible scholar suggests, in order to invoke all the safeguards and privileges that were available to a man's sister, but not to his wife. But the only explanation that made sense to biblical redactors, that is, editors, is the one that shows us the otherwise worthy patriarchs as timid souls who were perfectly willing to consign their wives to the beds of powerful men in exchange for their own physical safety and perhaps a king's reward. What is this, spousal abuse? And why doesn't Sarah protest? Once again, God ends the charade. And as the story continues, God came to Abimelech in a dream. You're as good as dead because the woman you have taken, she's married. Now, it's not a crime in biblical law that Abimelech may have had multiple wives. That's not the sin, quote unquote. The only crime is that she now had more than one man. Man can have as many women as he wants in biblical law, but a woman has only one man. The sin was against Abraham. So here's an issue to wrap our brains around. Is biblical law really sexist? And the story continues as we read it. Similar to the previous story. And Abraham just rationalizes at the very end, verse 12. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not my mother, and she became my wife. Basically, parsing words here. And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, this is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother. Jackass. Apparently he knows that she loves him. Does he sound like a pimp to you? And here's how you can prove you love me. Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham. And he returned Sarah, his wife, to him. The wages of vice. And amazingly, Abimelech accepts this feeble explanation. And Abimelech says, my land is before you, live wherever you like. To Sarai said, I'm giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. Isn't that nice? Abraham prayed to God. God healed Abimelech. The Lord was gracious to Sarah and did for Sarah what he had promised. She became pregnant, bore to Abraham a son in his old age. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. And of course, a great feast. At last, Abraham starts to honor Sarah's progeny. Sarah saw the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. She said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son. Sarah lived in the end to be 127 years old. She died in Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron, as we call it, Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went to mourn Sarah and weep over her. Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, I am an alien and stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site. Afterward, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in a cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. Is this a picture of sincere mourning? Maybe. Or does the text turn even Sarah's death into a business transaction, essentially? Certainly it's going to give the Israelites a claim on the land. After all, he made a transaction, it was deeded to him. Sarah lived to be 127 years old, died at Kiryat Arba, that is Hebron. And Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. And here's the same verse in Hebrew. V'tamat Sarah b'Kiryat Arba hi Hebron be'eretz Canaan v'yavo Avraham lispod Sarah l'Sarah ulivkota, and to weep over her. Now, we show it to you in Hebrew. You don't need to read the Hebrew to look at the last word, and you notice one letter is smaller. If you take this small kaf out of the word entirely, what do you have left? Ve'livkota, to weep for her, becomes u levata, and for her daughter. What? It's based on a rabbinic passage in the Babylonian Talmud that Abraham and Sarah also had a daughter who died at the same time as Sarah. So a little bit of interesting wordplay, kind of mystical, goes on in this passage as well. The rabbis are always reading things into the text and finding hidden meanings there. But sure enough, as we read from the Torah today, that letter is always writ small. Perhaps it's supposed to be omitted. In any case, Machpelah also has a Hebrew meaning, double. Double. The small kaf in the word Velif Kota tells us that Abraham contained his grief, bearing his pain in his heart, and not making himself a spectacle due to his sense of modesty. You can imagine him gathering his robes up to his heart with this small, tight kaf, his kaf yad in Hebrew, the palm of his hand to enclose and control his feelings and his breaking heart. So that's another way to look at the text as deep and sincere mourning and a warmth and a tenderness. But it's all a matter of interpretation and, of course, many different possibilities, which is what we like to look at throughout. In any case, from that day to this, Hebron is revered as a very holy site to the Jewish people. You're looking here at a photo of the exact spot where, in tradition, Sarah and the other biblical patriarchs and matriarchs are buried. So let it be written. So let it be done.